Hello, and welcome to today's Collective Impact Virtual Coffee. I'm Sherry Brady, Associate Director of Strategic Partners at the Aspen Institute Forum for Community Solutions, and we are delighted to have you here with us today. Thanks for joining. Before we dive into the conversation with today's guest, I'm going to spend a few minutes going over some things with the session to orient you. Our conversation today will last about 60 minutes, 60 seconds. Whoo, I wish. Whoo! And feel free to grab a literal cup of coffee or tea to sit down and join us as we chat. The virtual coffee series is really intentionally set up to be a casual learning experience where we get to hear from practitioners in the field about their work. We'll spend roughly the first half of our time together hosting a discussion with today's guests, Nicole and Abby, and then we will open up to questions from all of you. You can put your questions in the question box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. We will sort through them and try to get through as many as time allows us. In addition, this session is being recorded and we'll be making the recording available to you in the next day or so. Please keep an eye out for an email announcing when the recording is up in the Collective Impact Forum. Excuse me, in the forum library, and we will be notifying you of this on the email when we register, that you used when you registered for this coffee. One note on the handouts, you can find a copy of today's presentation available under the handout tab on the right of your screen. Just click on that and you will be able to download it directly from the webinar platform. You will also be able to access it in the forum resource library when we post the recording. Next slide. If you're having technical difficulties, you can ask for assistance in the question box on the right, or you can email info@collectiveimpact.org. And you can also share your thoughts and comments on Twitter using the hashtags that's on the screen currently. And again, if you have a question, just use the question and answer box on the right of your screen. Next slide. During our virtual coffee series, we have been talking with a variety of collective impact initiatives who participated in a research study on the collective impact approach. The research study, When Collective Impact Has an Impact, examines the main question, to what extent and under what conditions does the collective impact approach contribute to systems and population change? The study was commissioned by the Collective Impact Forum and was conducted by a research team from ORS and Spark Policy Institute. The study's primary research question, I just told you that. So our guests today, next slide, were a part of the 25 who were interviewed as a part of this project, the Milwaukee Teen Pregnancy Initiative and the Connecticut Juvenile Justice Alliance. To explore these questions, we worked at 25 sites and generated a rich set of findings that we hope will be useful in the field of collective impact. The full report can be downloaded from the Collective Impact Forum website or the ORS Impact or Spark Policy websites. In addition, we did a webinar on the issues from this report with the research study team, and a copy of this webinar is also available in the Collective Impact Forum resource library. During this virtual coffee series, we have been diving into different topics that arose from the study, including gathering and sharing data, advancing equity, and sustaining momentum over the long term. And today we're going to be focusing on sustaining momentum. Next slide. Sorry, I'm trying to turn off my phone and I was trying to do it subtly, but I actually can't because I'm afraid that it will ring while we're here. So let me just do that before we get started. Sorry about that, guys. I thought I had done it. Today I'm delighted to introduce our guest, Nicole Angresano from the Milwaukee Teen Pregnancy Initiative, WAVE, and Abby Anderson from the Connecticut Juvenile Justice Alliance. As I said, both Nicole and Abby's initiatives participated in the research study, and today we'll be discussing with them their experience in sustaining momentum with their initiatives over the long term. First, allow me to introduce Abby Anderson. Abby joined the Connecticut Juvenile Justice Alliance in 2004 and has been executive director since 2008. Under her leadership, the Alliance has a strong visible advocacy and policy, has been a strong and visible advocacy and policy organization with the mission to end the criminalization of children. The Alliance is most well known for spearheading the Raise the Age campaign from 16 to 18. The Alliance is committed to narrowing the funnel into juvenile justice, pushing for awareness and reduction of racial and ethnic disparities, school-based arrests, and the use of the juvenile justice system to address children's mental health issues. And next, we have Nicole Angresano. Nicole has been with United Way since 2007, where she serves as Vice President of Community Impact. In this role, she oversees more than 230 United Way funded health and human service programs, as well as leading United Way's community-wide teen pregnancy prevention efforts aimed at reducing Milwaukee's rate of births to teens. United Way's efforts in this area have been recognized as a national best practice. Under Nicole Stewart, United Way was named the backbone organization for the Life Course Initiative for Healthy Families, focused on reducing infant mortality. Nicole and Abby, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah,
Great.
thank you.
Great. So we're going to get started a little bit, and we want to give you a chance to share a little bit with us about your initiative and goals that you're working toward. We're going to start with Abby's. And actually, if you can go back to the information on Abby's program so that people can just have that, and then we can go back to it. Great. So Abby, if you get started.
Sure. So great to be here today, and I appreciate the chance to have this conversation. Sherry and Nicole and I got to talk about a week or so ago, and it was great just on that to learn peer-to-peer in this way. So I'm excited for this conversation as well. As Sherry mentioned, the Alliance we are a statewide public policy and advocacy organization. We're the only organization in Connecticut that's purely focused on juvenile justice reform. The way we're able to do that is because we are a true coalition. So the staff of the organization, the Alliance itself is 3. And that's because we have this amazing steering committee, advisory board of the folks who are on the ground in the courts, providing services, representing young people, doing the research, doing the family advocacy as well. And we are able to take all of the information that they are seeing on the ground every day and bring that to the different tables. So for the longest time, we've talked about ourselves as sort of the hub of the wheel. So we're sort of in the middle, and sometimes we're there talking to the grassroots folks who are at the 1-foot level, and then other times we're at statewide policy tables at the 20,000-foot level. So it was mentioned, one of the things that we're most well known for, although it drives me nuts because it happened in 2007 and 2010 and 12, is the Raise the Age initiative, getting 16 and 17-year-olds out of the adult court. Connecticut was one of the last 3 states to have the age of adulthood at 16. New York is currently raising its age, and North Carolina is now the lone holdout. So that was a big deal for us, and then the implementation of that was a huge thing. But then also one of our biggest goals lately is the recognition that while we've done a lot of things really well, a gap in our work has been making sure that our work is led and directed by those with directly impacted by the system itself. So about a year ago, we started working with a cadre of young people called Justice Advisors. They are folks who are formerly system involved to whatever level that means, either directly or secondhand, and making sure that we are following a 2-pronged approach, right? So we have earned seats at tables that probably should be filled by those who have a different kind of expertise from having lived through this system. So we are working side by side to ensure that we are training formerly system involved folks to be able to sit at the tables that we sit at, while simultaneously working to create different tables that are founded and really rooted in equity. So that's sort of what we're going through as a coalition, is looking at this next step of evolution to make sure that we are credibly, practicing what we're preaching. If we're saying that systems have to be driven by those, closest to the problem is closest to the solution, that we need to be living that as well. So that's sort of our latest undertaking.
Great. And as a proud net mugger, I think that's great. So Nicole?
Thank you so much. I share Abby's enthusiasm and appreciation for being included in this opportunity today. So thank you for that. Here in Milwaukee, the United Way of Greater Milwaukee and Waukesha County is proud to serve as the backbone for now entering our 12th year of a collective impact effort to reduce birth to teens in our community. The impetus for this initiative was really a couple of pretty alarming national level stories around the data and the issue in Milwaukee. Now, that's not to say that that was a new issue, but it was presented on the national landscape in such a way that I think people finally felt compelled to act in a more unified manner. I have to honor and give shout outs to the initiatives that preceded this, who laid so much groundwork, who built so much capacity. We would not be where we are today without the public health and education, et cetera, professionals that came before us. I'm very grateful to have been able to learn from their work. We really, one of the things that's interesting about this project, and I think this extends to Abby's work too, is that our initiatives were sort of doing collective impact before we really had the literature or the definition around collective impact. So we got some things right, and then we left a few things out that we had to go back and build once we understood the literature more. But it's so exciting and gratifying to see what this model has become and its applicability across myriad issues in our country and elsewhere. So what we decided to do here in Milwaukee was acknowledge that as a community we had become complacent around the issue of teen births. I want to make it very clear that this has never been, nor will it ever be, an initiative that's shame-based or that has anything but positive support for those teens who are parents or are becoming parents. It's critical that we embrace them and provide them with every option and opportunity that they can have. But what we had to say and what we had to acknowledge really publicly is that birth to teens is simply not an ideal situation. That doesn't mean that there aren't parents who have done an extraordinary job under difficult circumstances, and I really want to honor that. But what we know and what the data bears out over and over again is that when young people become parents too soon, a few things are happening. One, in many cases in our community, girls were being impregnated by adult men. This was an issue really regarding sexual violence and statutory rape, and we need to talk about that openly. The idea that teen pregnancy results from a romantic interlude on the prom night is really an antiquated idea, and that's simply not what's happening. And two, the data bears this out. Academic, economic, social outcomes are not as good for young people who become parents too soon. It's more difficult for them to finish school. It's financially limiting. So really for us, the perspective was we want our young people to not have their lives predetermined for them at the age of 15 and 16. We want them to have every opportunity and every option. And so we framed a broad-based initiative around just that.
Great. That sounds great. Sorry, I'm having difficulty with my camera, which I'm not sure why, but I'm trying to get it fixed. So I apologize for that, guys. As long as you guys are still on the screen, no one really needs to see me. But can we go to slide 9, please? Great. When we were talking about this virtual coffee, as Abby mentioned earlier, that we had a conversation, and as we as a team were putting it together, one of the resources we leaned on was sort of this core elements of sustainability that the Tamarack Institute and the Collective Impact Forum have put together based on our work with a wide range of collaborations. In our experiences and in conversations with many of these practitioners across the field, we realize that the cultivating and attending of these elements can be very helpful in sustaining the work over a long period of time. These elements are here on the slide. I won't read them. But I know that a couple of these elements, as we had our earlier conversation, resonated with you both, including conditions around sustaining effective collaborations and relationships, as well as incorporated learning and innovation within your work. So I'd love to hear from each of you about how these elements have been cultivated in your work. And we can start with Nicole and then go to Abby.
Sure, great. So just starting with the first bullet, one of the, I think, extraordinary things about our initiative is the leadership commitment that both predated the initiative and that is sustained today. United Ways are not necessarily often known for taking on what some might perceive as controversial topics. So for us to, at the time, our president and board of directors really did go out on a limb to say this is an issue we can't ignore, and if we're really going to walk the walk in this community, we're going to have to put our human and financial capital behind this topic. So the initial commitment from our then president and board was significant. In 2006, at the start of this initiative, we named two co-chairs, the then Commissioner of Health and the then president and publisher of our local paper. And they were the co-chairs for the next 11 years. And I think that's an extraordinary testament to this community and the commitment that they've had to initiatives when both of them are highly in demand and could have certainly floated to other initiatives. So for us, it really came with the bravery of our organization's leadership saying we're going to do something about this, and then just an extraordinary group of people both at the co-chair level and on our advisory committee who have been involved in this since day one.
That's great. And that is so key to keeping things going. How about you, Abby?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we talked about that Nicole and I sort of shared a conversation around is this issue of leadership. You know, for me, 1 and 2 there, the leadership commitment and also the effective relationships are so interchangeable because I don't know, 98% of what we do is relationship building, relationship management. And when those relationships work, you can have that collaboration and have that learning and be able to demonstrate results, right? But if there isn't trust built both between individuals and between organization to organization, it makes things really difficult. And I know Nicole and I really both agreed that having conversations and the ability to negotiate egos is a big piece of this. And we talk about it in our office all the time, being personally egoless, but being organizationally egoless as well, especially as sort of using the collective impact buzzwords as the hub organization. You know, it can't be about us being in it for the credit. It has to be about looking around and figuring out who's around our table, who has the core competencies to get things done, and what does that look like? And we say all the time, like, as long as the people who are our funders understand what we're doing, and if we can say to them, listen, there's this huge event, you're not going to see us or our logo anywhere, which was strategic for X reason, but let me tell you what we were doing behind the scenes. It doesn't matter if anybody else knows what's, you know, where we were. One of the jokes in our office for a really long time was for, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years, you'd go to events where different legislators were retiring or getting some award, and they'd be awarded for all of their leadership around the Raise the Age campaign. And we'd all look at each other and go, have you ever seen this guy before? I've never seen this guy before. But we'd clap like crazy, right? Because the more people who have taken ownership and responsibility for something, the longer it can be sustainable and moves forward. So we would just sort of laugh about that. But being able to really talk to the people around the table and make sure everybody understands what they're doing, why they're doing it, and that everybody is going to get a turn to shine, and that just takes some time to build those relationships so that people understand, you know, somebody's always going to be stepping forward, which means somebody else is going to have to be stepping back, but we still see you, you know.
Exactly. And I think I just want to honor and lift one of the other things Abby said earlier was that we talk about leadership and we're not always talking about the right things. So when I talk about the leadership in the formal sense, certainly the co-chairs and the leadership of the organization, but the leaders of this initiative have been, and I think this is the same thing that's happening in Connecticut, is increasingly over the decade that we've been doing this work, the leadership has really come from the young people and the target audiences that we're working with. And so really making sure that we've created not just space at the table, but other tables, and that leadership, or I would say leadership today looks different than it did when we started. And we still have, you know, there are certainly people in core roles that don't necessarily reflect ethnically or demographically the population we serve, but we've worked very, very hard to make sure that leadership looks a lot different than it used to in terms of whose voice is really driving the content of our work.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And you know, we're advocating and promoting policy for young people, and so our newest hire is 20 years old. And if there's one experience that has made me feel older than ever and reinvigorated at the same time is coming to work with a 20-year-old every day. It's a wonderful, wonderful experience, and I'm very tired.
Yeah. Yeah, we work with young people here too, and some days we're at meetings with them. I'm like, let's go do this and this, that. And I'm like, I'm going home and going to bed, guys. I'm
Exactly.
old.
I need a nap, and then I will join you again.
Exactly.
Yep.
That's great. And I think that also is in handy when you think about sort of the relationships and the trust that you're trying to build in the communities that you're working with. I'm going to ask another question, but I want to remind folks that they can ask questions by using the question box on the right to the screen. And please, because we're going to get to your questions in a little bit. I know that one of the sustainability challenges that can be difficult when maintaining long-term commitments is with a funding partner. Sometimes the funding priorities evolve, or they change, right? Or doesn't mesh well with sort of doing multi-year commitments. And it's always sort of this song and dance about how do we make this attractive again to a funder or move on to a different funders. But sort of what conditions have you found have been most helpful to encourage sort of maintaining a multi-year partnership with funders?
Well, I think United Way is uniquely positioned because we are self-funding in many ways, right? So for United Way to be a backbone, and I think this is something that's important for those on the call who are part of that network, is we drive and support financially a lot of this work. But I think the question that you're asking, which is more important, is how do you keep these issues relevant in front of funders who are getting pulled in myriad directions? We know that as important as these issues are to those of us on this call, there's a lot of other issues in both of our communities that also deserve attention and financing. So one of the things that we've done, and I think we started this very early, was we created a collaborative funding opportunity. So in Milwaukee, at one point there were 9, now there's about 7 funders put in money at the beginning of the year, a pooled, shared fund, and then together each of us that funds this work has ownership over how those funds are invested, separate or independent from any one of our boards of directors. So we made it very clear that although we're going to be the backbone, we take responsibility for the staffing and a lot of the core work. We need partners both on the programmatic side and on the funding side. So the collaborative funding model has been something that's worked very well in our community.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is one of those times where I'm probably supposed to have a lot of chutzpah and say that, like, it's worked for us because we are so awesome. And I'm sure that's part of it. We have been really lucky in the sense that the Tao Foundation is a family foundation here in Connecticut that has really made juvenile justice policy a core function of what it does. So they committed to the organization early and have been one of our backbone funders and have never asked that question that funders ask of nonprofits, which is so silly. Well, how are you going to be sustainable? Like, well, I'm not going to start manufacturing T-shirts. Like, our job is to.
Right.
So eventually, I hope that there isn't a juvenile justice system anymore, so we don't have to exist. But other than that, we're going to need somebody to fund us. And so we have had this organization that has funded us that has also then introduced us to their friends in the funding world. So the Public Welfare Foundation has been a great supporter of ours as well. We know that won't last forever, but we are really looking at one of the models. As I said, we're the only organization in Connecticut that's solely focused on juvenile justice public policy change. So for the most part, that means the folks around the table that we're collaborating with, we're not competing with. Right. So that really helps that we have an understanding around that table of who's doing what, how we differentiate from each other, and we're not trying to duplicate. And we're very, Connecticut is basically a small town. So we talk a lot about, everybody knows everybody. So it's not like, oh my gosh, I had no idea you were applying for that grant too. It can be, hey, we're both applying. Are you focusing on X? Great, because we're doing Y, and we'll talk about how those two things are really helpful to each other. So I think that's a real piece. I would like to plug here the work of Vu Lee. If anybody follows Nonprofit AF, it's an amazing blog where he does a lot of writing on this question. I would encourage any funders out there to take a look at it, but also nonprofit folks out there, because he has a lot of thoughts about this that I think are incredibly helpful.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, Vule actually spoke at our May convening this year. He was
He's so lucky.
so the Collective Impact Forum, if you go, it's the video of it is in our resource library as well. So please check that out, because he raised a lot of these very important points that funders need to be thinking about as we do this work.
If I could add one more, can I just add one more point? I didn't want to lose it, and that'll happen because I'm not 20 anymore. So I used to be 20. Is that it's really imperative that when you're overseeing these initiatives that you make the case of the importance of it across a variety of settings. And what I mean is that not everybody cares about teen pregnancy prevention for the reason that I do. Not
Right.
every funder, not every donor frames this around, which, for me personally, is an issue of social justice, right? So very early on, we understood the importance of making this issue matter to people across the aisle, making it matter in more than just one way. So, for example, very briefly, one of the issues that we brought up early on was the fact that most children born to teens are indeed paid for by taxpayer dollars, whether through insurance or other public services available down the road. And for folks, that's a concerning thing. So even if you don't care about this issue for the same reason that I do, or you don't care about juvenile justice reform for the same reasons that Abby does, you should care about it for some reason. And if we're doing our job correctly, we're going to make the case that this matters on an economic level, on a social level, perhaps on a public health level, and then you can pick the reason you care about it, but we're still driving towards the same outcomes.
Great.
Yes, I'll signal boost that all day, Nicole.
No, I highly agree. So question from the audience: how do you maintain momentum and consistency in the midst of leadership changes, particularly as these efforts have spanned for 10 plus years?
Great question. One of the things that's been really gratifying about the work is that we have a quarterly meeting. So 4 times a year, we bring all of the committee members together. The real work's happening on the work group level and things like that, but we do have an oversight committee that is very attached. And, for whatever reason, I don't know if there's, I don't know, to Abby's point, maybe it's just our awesomeness. I don't know. People have remained as engaged and involved as they have been from day one, 11 and a half years ago. I think what we've done is really been inclusive of other voices. I think we have listened to feedback, both positive and negative, and incorporated it into our work. We don't have committee members in name only. We actually thoughtfully consider what their input is. We have working groups that are just that, working groups that drive many pieces of this octopi-like initiative that we've got going on. And so I think inclusivity, voice, authenticity, all of those things contribute to people feeling valued. And quite frankly, we've been successful. And so there's this excitement that every time we come together at the October or November meeting, that for 11 years in a row, the data has been that these birth rates have gone down. That makes us a pretty easy sell.
Yeah, it's interesting. My first instinct, which I will say second, was to go in a different direction. But I think one of the pieces around why we're able to move forward even among changes is, and I'm sure this is true for Sherry too, we talk about this all the time, juvenile justice is actually about everything, right? It's about housing, it's about poverty, it's about race more than just about anything. It's about class, it's about education. The juvenile justice system actually doesn't exist if the other systems that were set up to do their jobs actually did them, right? So it's almost like every 3 years, my job changes completely, right? So where we're working on raise the age stuff, we were working a lot on adolescent brain development. We were working on, economic drivers. And then we started to work on school-based arrests. So suddenly I had to become a passable expert on education policy. And then we started really diving into racial justice issues, which is, then you're unpacking a whole lot of different learning, all of those different worlds. So the core mission doesn't change, but how it is executed and the aspect of the work that we're focusing on changes so much that there's often new people and new voices and new people in coalition around that table. actually, we had our board meeting today from 1 to 3, which I ducked out of early, and we were doing a presentation, on this, what we did this summer as a staff, right? And it was like rebuilding. Basically, today was presenting to our board how we envision basically changing everything about what we do and how we do it, except our mission. Right. So we'd like to change the expression of our mission. And one of our members said, like, what's so great about this is it's so exciting. Like it's reinvigorating. And Ileana, our newest staff person, she's like, you've brought so much energy. So it's changing all the time, which actually makes change less scary because it's the norm. And the thing that I was going to start with is we just haven't changed leadership. I've been here since 2004.
We haven't either. Yeah, that's a hard
exactly.
question.
We haven't done that. And I will say, I think that's a problem in the nonprofit field, right? I'm not sure we always change enough. I think, self-servingly, I think because there have been a lot of other changes in our organization. I think all of the other staff has turned over 2 or 3 times. And we've tried to be really thoughtful about that in terms of making sure we're more reflective of our community and who we're serving. But that, I think, has been that and also the leadership. Nicole, you said this, leadership doesn't necessarily mean your face or my face, right? I think the leadership in reality is different on the ground sometimes than it is on the masthead. And we try to really promote that as well.
I think as well, one of the things that Abby said is so important is that neither of these topics are stagnant, right? So we have been, we've been pretty pleased with ourselves for a decade, right? The teen birth rate has gone down every year. We've been recognized in a lot of different forms. It's fantastic. But meanwhile, our STI rates haven't budged. In fact, they've gone the wrong way. So we really had to last year do some pretty deep self-reflection on if we're doing such a heck of a good job here, and we're preventing pregnancy, why in the world is our community facing what we think is a pretty astonishing uptick simultaneously to this in chlamydia, syphilis, and even HIV? So for us, it's really, okay, we did a good job in part of this. Clearly, in our community, girls are contracepting and or teens are delaying sexual behavior until later. But what's not happening clearly is condom use, right? So we have to think about, okay, have we been too narrow in our focus? Did we emphasize girls too much, or people that identify as female too much in this strategy? So we've gone back, we've reinvigorated a committee just around STI prevention. We've brought to our board of directors, we want this to be about adolescent health outcomes more broadly, and we're not going to simply pat ourselves on the back because the teen birth rate has gone down when all of this other stuff is happening at the same time. So I think, again, people are excited because there's something new to talk about. They're excited because we're showing a willingness to, I think, transition and grow and not just say, okay, we solved that, we're done. And that's the same, with the same issues that Abby's working on. These are not static issues.
Right. And I can't emphasize that enough. I mean, one of the things that just happened here is we'd been talking about closing our juvenile training school, which is a euphemism for prison. So we were working to close our youth prison, since I started working here, and it closed April 1st. And you would have thought we threw a big party, but unfortunately they closed a $53 million facility and, didn't reinvest that into programming for young people. So we have this great victory, and at the same time, it was a defeat in some ways. So we have this conversation internally about how do you message that. So it's almost like every time you turn around a corner, we're the kind of people that like, oh, but this is a new challenge. So if anything, we have to really challenge ourselves to slow down and say, wait a second, that was a victory. And now let's move on to the next hurdle. But yes, I think the people around the table are so excited for the next challenge that sometimes it's harnessing the reindeer team.
That's great. I think that was very helpful. I think it's this idea of always thinking about what the next goal is, and also thinking about sort of how these connect, because these issues aren't siloed. And I think for a long time the sector really had this idea that issues were siloed, and sort of if you cure the juvenile justice problem, but it's like sort of what are the things that are leading to that, and how do you deal with that, or what are the other issues that are going on in these young people's lives that they're engaging in risky behavior that's having these outcomes. So another question is, do you have any tips on how to build trust between organizations? The person who asked the question talked about how they have individuals within organizations that they've built trust with over time, who sort of represent these organizations, but they don't necessarily trust the organizations themselves as a whole. So if that person leaves, there isn't that connection or potentially starting from scratch with a new person without having those connections to organizations. So thoughts on how they can help that.
Nicole?
Sure, I was pausing meaningfully, so I wasn't always going first. That's a really great question, and I think there's a couple things at play here. One is, I think a lot of us that are in social services, we come from a place of good intention, and we come to a table and think that because we have good intentions, everyone should just know that about us, and we should all work together. And trust takes time, and we live, like Connecticut is essentially a big town. Milwaukee is a small town that likes to pretend it's a big city. We all know each other. There is history and I would say shared successes and shared heartbreaks in the social services sector that we have to honor and acknowledge. We also live in a community, or in our city in particular, that is quite racially segregated. And this issue, because it's so steeped in inequity and racial disparities, we have to, again, honor and bring those conversations in. So by acknowledging maybe our missteps of the past, by sharing ownership, I think both of us have talked earlier about sharing the victories. Mm-hmm. Serving as the backbone does not mean that you get to take credit for every darn thing that happens. And even when people will give you credit, and certainly we're very grateful for people's reception to this, the critical importance of elevating the other work, not everybody has the brand and the bandwidth that United Way has. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that none of this work happens without the small nonprofits, without the schools, without the folks that are out there every day. And when given the opportunity to talk about them, I make an effort to do so. And I think trust comes from an awareness that we're not here to compete. We're here to work together to achieve a meaningful outcome.
Yeah, I think what the only thing I would add to that is some of it is, and we were talking earlier about this egoless practice, and it is being very intentional on our part about knowing what our values are and going in early and often and communicating those to people. So, we deal a lot in our work with different state agency leaders. So if you want to talk about how you deal with leadership changes and leadership challenges, I would say that even though we don't do like a ton of lobbying, is like official lobbying, we still have a lot of relationships with people in elected positions, and those are changing all the time, right? And the state agencies are appointed positions, so we're dealing with changing political realities. Every 2 years we have elections in Connecticut. So it's when we meet somebody, it's going in, and we always say to people, listen, we are a collaborative organization, first, second, and third. We are not a gotcha organization. So if I have a problem, if I hear about a rumor about something going on in a juvenile detention center, I'm going to call the head of the juvenile detention center, and I'm going to say, listen, I heard this thing that's going on. What's happening? And if we're going to talk, if we're going to talk to the press, I'm going to call that person and say, listen, this is the quote, so FYI, he's going to be calling you next, just so that they know we want to work with you, and I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. And I'll be honest, there's been a leadership position in Connecticut that we have not been able to have that conversation, that kind of relationship with, and it's been an adversarial relationship. And we'll play that game if that's what the other person has decided, or the other organization has decided they want to do. But one of the things that I've really had to learn is to be very intentional about what our organizational goals are, and knowing that there are some times where I'm going to have to go in and really take positions and do things that might not be my gut. My gut might say, boy, that person's being really annoying, and I can't believe they always need to be the one that I call them, and they don't, and so just knowing, have that person you can blow off steam with, and then go into that relationship and be like, oh, man, it is great to see you. I'm so glad you're here. Not being inauthentic, but really knowing that some people need, different relationships need different things. But I think it unfortunately, some of it's just about time, but a lot of it is being willing to. I'm working really hard not to say the bigger person in the relationship,
Oh,
but
you
sometimes
have to take
that's
the
what it
high
is.
road. Sure.
It's
Yeah.
being
You're my
willing
friend.
to
Go ahead. We gotcha.
100% being willing to take the high road 125% of the time.
Yeah, and
Um,
I think, one of the constant themes is that trust takes time, and you have to put in the work. Again, I think some of our early challenges were that we just assumed because we were all at the same table that we all had the same experiences, that we were all agreeing with each other. But I think that the one thing that goes the furthest is again, authenticity and follow through.
Yes.
Do what you said you were going to do, and if you make a mistake, and I certainly have, you own that and you move forward, right? So we try very, very hard to own our lumps as well as our sugar, right? So that's not even a real thing. I just made that up. To make sure that we are constantly communicating, that we're owning our errors, that we're sharing space, that we are making room for other people and other voices, and that we're constantly where it's continuous quality improvement, right? We never rest. We're constantly reflecting on, did we do this right? What should we have done instead? Who wasn't at this meeting that should have been? And there is a lot to Abby's point about trying to be the bigger person and eating crow even when it's not your crow to eat.
Right, and I was just going to say thank you for saying that about consistency, because what I wanted to say, and you better be living what you're talking, because I think you and I probably are both in positions where people are watching every move you make, and so what's great about our coalition and the rest of our team is really holding each other accountable too. So knowing, like, hey, you say all the time, that you got to be the bigger person. Did you do that today? And that back and forth accountability, I think, is really important as well.
I want to follow up on something that you both sort of mentioned was about results and sort of outcomes, thinking about sort of that's the end goal, sort of thinking about sort of evaluation and demonstrating results, which is one of the factors here with sustainability, and sort of how do you handle sort of setbacks and results, or when, you probably results and data helped you sort of decide the tactics that you're going to take and what you're going to do, but really thinking about how do you think about when your results aren't sort of what you want? Thinking about, Nicole, your example of STIs still either rising, staying the same or rising, even though you sort of solved one set of problems around teens having sex, and I use problems with quotation marks, but one sort of issues around that, and sort of how do you sort of deal with that when the outcome data is not necessarily what you want it to be or not moving in the direction that you want it to go?
Yeah, I mean, the STI example is spot on for this question as well, which is, I think there has to be a commitment to, again, almost a vigilance around the data and the outcomes, and really making sure that we're paying attention to what's actually going on and not making false assumptions about the whys or the hows. And I can tell you, I mean, it is it's not that we did something wrong by focusing more heavily on, or maybe it was wrong, but we did the best we could under what we knew at the time. But there has to be a willingness to step back and say, okay, we got some of this right, but we really missed this. Why did we miss it? What did we leave out? Who didn't we have at the table that we should have? And let's regroup and move forward. And it also comes down to, again, this I say the word transparency a lot, but I really believe in it, which is own it, talk about it, and do better next time.
Yeah, I think the only thing I can add to that is in terms of public policy and advocacy work and community organizing, process a lot of times is just as important as outcome, because there are things I think we've all experienced in whatever level, professional or personal, when you've got policymakers involved, you can do everything right in the textbook 100%, and when that vote comes for a call, it might not go your way, and because somebody was annoyed because somebody else took their parking spot this morning, so I'm not voting for your bill no matter what you do. I mean, that kind of stuff happens, and so being very realistic among our board and among our funders about what is our goal, right? And what are we trying to achieve, and what are those actual measures, and making sure that those are a broader base of things than, we achieved this major policy goal in 12 months, or, sometimes there are bills that are brought up that we don't think are ever going to pass, but it's the ability to get people in communities talking about those issues is what our actual goal was. So as long as we're communicating that internally and externally, then if a bill doesn't pass, it's not a failure, because we didn't want it to pass anyway. We wanted somebody to be talking about school resource officers.
Or you did want to pass that part. Oh, no, go ahead.
Okay, sorry, this is actually one of the things I wanted to follow up as you were talking about, sort of one of the real goals being about community engagement and having folks talking about these issues. Sort of, how do you build and sort of expand your different tables to ensure that you're authentically engaging the community that you're working with, and that grassroots folks feel agency and power to be able to speak out and have a say in what's happening, even if they're not a part of your steering committee, or if they are a part of it, sort of how that works, and looking at that sort of informal and community leadership versus sort of what we think about as leaders, as you talked about being the face of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, this goes back to an earlier question about owning the stuff you're not doing great, or how do you rebound, or how do you lead through the losses, right? And so we maybe 2.5 years ago, we're doing a project around really understanding the needs of girls in the juvenile justice system, and we were doing a listening session, and a young woman who I'll be forever grateful for said, "Oh, what are you doing? Oh, you're here for a listening session? So like we'll see you and you'll be here for like 20 minutes, and we'll never see you again? Oh, okay, cool. We're used to it." And she couldn't have been more right. Right? We were transactional in what we were doing, and what we learned through that year-long process of doing listening sessions and moving around and talking to young people was that young women in the justice system didn't feel like they had a voice or a choice in what was happening to them. And our advocacy message was, whether you're dealing with a girl one-on-one or systemically, they have to have a voice and choice in what's going on. And it was a real moment for us of, if we're telling other people they've got to do that, are we doing that internally? Is that true for us? Are we practicing what we're preaching? And, we realized that while we had done some of it, we were not doing nearly as well as we could or needed to be doing. So it's been about 12 to 18 month process of self-evaluation. We've done a racial justice assessment tool of our organization, and really looking at that about who is around our steering committee table. So the justice advisors, as they have come in, are at our steering committee table now. They have equal ability to sit at that table, but we're still in the process of figuring that out. One of the intentional decisions, as we had a position, I said we're a 3-person team. We were a 2-person team for about 8 months because we knew we didn't want to just hire like we had always hired in the past, but that we needed that next hire to really reflect our changing living of our values, which is how, we really intentionally hired somebody with, who's younger, who has previous system experience to be part of our core leadership team. So that it's really hard. In the sense that if that's not how you've always been doing it, you need to change. It's really easy in that you need to change your tables so that those are the people who make them up. So it's like an easy thing to say, and depending on where you are in your organization and where leadership is and what your organization has been like in the past, it can be easier or harder to execute. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's certainly not an overnight thing, and it's a lot of conversations and real talk, and then being willing to fall on your face and get back up.
Nicole,
Abby really covered that. Yeah, Abby covered that beautifully. I just wanted to reinforce, in particular, one of the things that we did within the past few years that, was sort of one of those, like, why didn't we do this sooner, was we absolutely walked the walk in terms of hiring practices, right? And not only did we add 5 at one point public allies to work on this group, and these are public allies from the highest impacted zip codes. We also created a position, not within the teen pregnancy work because but we have a similar model working on infant mortality, and we created a position just for, again, a member of the impacted community, in this case, a woman from an impacted zip code who herself had suffered a poor birth outcome, who really was trying to find her way to channel her own personal experience into this work. And it's been the best addition of a hire we've had in terms of authentic voice and real life. I do want to say too, our steering committee is pretty big, and there are folks, I would say, from a wide variety of backgrounds and from different strategies, business leaders, faith leaders, et cetera. But that, and so we've always said, oh, well, we have an open door policy. Anybody can come to the meetings, but that's lazy, right? You have to really work on cultivating relationships. You have to work on making sure that if they come one time, that they're heard, that they feel that they're included, that you reach back out. So again, with all of this work, I think it comes back down to the very first point that Abby even made, which is it's about relationships and trust building. And, a lot of folks from the community have been inauthentically invited to spaces. A lot of folks have been interviewed as key informants, and you can't see it from the camera, but I have a bookshelf full of these reports right to my left of all the great reports that we've done and all the questions that we've asked. And community members feel pretty bruised by that because we haven't come back and implemented. We haven't really listened, and so we try very, very hard. We haven't always gotten it right in this past decade, but we try very, very hard to be accountable and to honor their input and to honor their voice.
Great.
I think that's a huge piece, Nicole, is that accountability to the community, and really asking them and meaning it. This is what we're trying to do. And having the relationship where they can say to me, Abby, I hear what you're trying to do, and I 100% believe that you think that that's what you're doing. I love you enough to tell you it's not, and you need to do that differently. Those aren't my favorite conversations, right? But they're incredibly valuable conversations, and being able to. Our board meeting today, we were talking about, okay, these are the results of, as we all sit down and looked at ourselves as a steering committee and said, you know what, we don't reflect the community well enough. So what are we going to do about that? And what's our plan for the next year of our measurable steps to try to address that? And I had one person from my steering committee email me after last month's meeting and say, hey, I'm a white guy in his 40s. I might not be the most appropriate person to be around this table. Let's talk about it. And just having some of those conversations, it's a process, but the authenticity, but also the accountability to the community, instead of looking at the community as we're trying to fix your problems, looking at the community and saying, what do you need, if anything, from us? And if you do need something, what is it, and how can I help?
Great. I'm looking at the time, so I just want to try to get in these last two questions. So one of the questions that came up as you were talking, Nicole, was about your large steering committee, was this idea of how do you structure your initiative to be flexible, adaptive, and not too top-down or hierarchical? So I'm just going to, if you each want to.
Great question. Yeah, so the steering committee, I hope none of them are watching because they might take this the wrong way, but let me say this about the steering committee. The steering committee is wonderful, and it's made up of a lot of power brokers, both grassroots and grass tops, leaders in the community, a very diverse group. We're very proud of that. But that's a group that gets together 4 times a year, talks through some high-level, sort of macro-level stuff, and then goes about their business. Where the real work happens, where the real representation and decision-making happens, is at those work group levels. And the work groups are populated with the folks that these are groups that meet at least monthly, that have policy implications, that are working, that create, that do, and then we feed that back up to the steering committee for their endorsement, and we want to make sure that they're all participating in it. But that's more of a let's bring everybody together, hold ourselves accountable, and then go back to our our respective businesses and associations and share what's going on. The work group, this is very much a bottom-up approach more than top-down. The work groups and the folks that serve on those is where the real work happens.
Great, thanks. Abby, do you have anything you want to add before I ask the next one?
No, I think that was good. I think
Okay,
that was
great. So last question before we sort of wrap up, and I thought that this was a good one, so I want to try to get to it. You guys talked a lot about sort of having egoless ethics with partner organizations, and so someone asked about sort of, given that a lot of small nonprofits, probably some of the nonprofits were at your table, in some cases, and I think in your case, in the United Way is a little bit different. You rely on recognition from your funders for your accomplishments. So how do you sort of overcome that flaw in our nonprofit sector, which has been going on for a long time, and sort of having this sort of instill this egoless ethic in partner organizations? I have some thoughts on that, but it's not my virtual coffee. You guys are today. So.
I don't know, Sherry. I'm interested in your thoughts too, Sherry, because that's a tough question.
Yeah, I could give you like 90 seconds and then yield the floor, Sherry. I'm happy to do that. I would say I'm going to be a broken record on this around relationships, right? So for us, it's really about having relationships with our funders and having those conversations with our funders. There have been multiple times where I have called a funder and said, this is what's going on. This is the backstory. I want you to be aware of how we've been involved in what's going on. We're not going to get credit publicly for this event or this thing or this, and this is why. This was a strategic decision. We need so-and-so to be the face of this. Or I think I mentioned before, there was just a situation in terms of there was a particular leader at one particular time in Connecticut that just didn't appreciate any input if it came from the mouth of advocates. So we had ideas, and it was, this person is going to be the voice of this comment because the person who needs to hear it can only hear it from X messenger. And it can't be from us. And having that conversation with the funder of, so this is the work that we did and this is how it's going forward, so that they understand what's going on, why it's happening, and they know that we know what we're doing and that we have been intentional about things. But again, it comes down to that relationship with the funder.
Nicole, anything to add?
Yeah, I think too, one of the things that we often ask ourselves, whether it's a joint grant application or it's somebody that's going to get awarded, which lead agency, which person, which name on the top of this letter is going to get us what we need to get? And that's been a really important discussion. If I'm the best person to ask because the result's going to be positive, then I should ask. If agency X is the best person to lead that grant and the money should go to them, then they should lead that grant, right? And so we're reinforcing that we are all in this together. I also have a different perspective because we're also a funder, right? So it's my responsibility to sift through applications and reports and understand that even if an agency is part of a broad coalition, they're clearly contributing their own capacity and talents to this work. And so, making sure my friends in the funding field understand the collective impact model, how coalitions work, is really important.
Great. So I want to thank you both so much, Nicole and Abby, for joining us and giving and sharing your wisdom with us. So I'm sure the audience thanks you as well. And thank you to the attendees for joining us today and sharing your questions. If you're interested in finding out more about these initiatives, be sure to check out their websites. That'll be great. And you saw that. And when you download the handouts, the information is again on the handouts. But before we wrap up, let me just remind you of a couple of things. We are going to be sharing this recording of the discussion shortly. So there'll be an email that'll be sent to the email that you used to register for the virtual coffee. And then we're also going to be sending a link to a short survey in that email that will ask about, feedback and hearing things that you would like to hear for later times. In addition, I want to share with you some upcoming learning events, both virtual and in person. Last week, we had to cancel a webinar on aligning partnerships due to Hurricane Florence. We're going to be rescheduling it soon, so we'll send out a new date as soon as we get that. It'll be sometime this fall once they are back up and running. And then for those who are looking for an in-person experience, we are hosting the workshop Champions for Change, Leading a Backbone Organization for Collective Impact this October 16th through 18th in Los Angeles. It's our longest running workshop that focuses on supporting backbone leaders and their teams. One note is that Champions usually does sell out in advance, so we are asking people to register sooner rather than later to make sure you get your spot, and because we're expecting it to fill up in the next couple of weeks. Again, I want to thank you for joining us. This has been a great conversation. I've never been to Wisconsin, but I'm looking forward to going, and my mom still lives in Connecticut, so I'll be going there soon, as a matter of
All right,
fact.
come visit. I probably know her, Sherry. It's
You
too cool to
probably
state.
do. Okay. Take care, and thanks so much for
Thank you
joining
so
us.
much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.